name is Leanne. I'm 29. Last spring, my younger sister got engaged, and for about 48 hours I was genuinely happy for her. Then she called to tell me I wouldn't be in the wedding party, not because of anything I'd done. Because, as she put it, she wanted the day to feel balanced and having me there would make things complicated. I asked her what that meant. She said I knew what it meant. I did not cry. I did not argue. I said okay and I got off the phone and I sat in my car in a parking garage for 20 minutes just listening to the ventilation system hum. 3 weeks later, I found a folder in my mother's filing cabinet that explained everything. Not just the wedding. All of it. Going back 11 years. If you've ever had a moment where something you thought was love turned out to be something else entirely, you might want to stick around for this one. My sister's name is Tessa. She's 26, 3 years younger than me, and she has always been the one the family arranged itself around. Not in a cruel way. At least not at first. She was quieter, more anxious. And our parents treated that as a reason to protect her from friction. I was the older one. I was supposed to be steadier. That dynamic got baked in early, and by the time we were both adults, nobody questioned it anymore. It was just the weather. When she called about the wedding, she was using her careful voice, the one she saved for conversations she'd already decided the outcome of. She said her fiancé's side was large, that the bridal party was getting expensive, and that she'd had to make some hard choices. I was one of the hard choices. She said she hoped I would still come as a guest and that it wouldn't change anything between us. I thanked her for telling me, said I needed a few days to think, and hung up before my voice could do anything embarrassing. Our mother called the next morning to explain Tessa's side of it. She used phrases like, "You know how she gets," and "This is her day," and "I hope you're not going to make this harder than it needs to be." I said I wasn't going to make anything harder, I just needed some time. My mother said time was something we didn't have a lot of, because the engagement party was in 6 weeks, and it would mean a lot to have everyone present and supportive. I agreed to come. I don't know why exactly. Old habits, maybe. The version of me that still believed showing up was enough to hold things together. The engagement party was held at my parents' house, a wide, split level in a suburb outside Columbus that they'd owned since before I was born. Relatives filled the backyard. My aunt had driven in from Pittsburgh. Cousins. I only saw at weddings and funerals were clustered near the drink table. Tessa moved through all of it in a pale yellow dress, and she was glowing the way people glow when everything is going exactly as they planned. My mother had asked me to help set up that morning. I came early, moved tables, arranged flowers, carried folding chairs from the garage to the yard. My father thanked me in that absent way of his, where the gratitude sounds genuine but somehow doesn't quite land. Tessa arrived 2 hours later, freshly showered, and immediately started rearranging things I had already arranged. My mother followed her around making small, agreeable sounds. I stood near the kitchen doorway and watched and felt that old familiar weight settle across my shoulders. Sometime during the cleanup, I went inside to look for more paper napkins. My mother had mentioned they were in the hallway closet, but the hallway closet was stuffed with coats and board games and a broken dehumidifier that had been sitting there since 2019. I started opening doors, looking for anything that resembled storage. The last door at the end of the hallway was my mother's small home office, more of an alcove with a desk and a two-drawer filing cabinet she used for tax documents and insurance papers. I wasn't looking for anything specific, I was looking for napkins. The top drawer was the one she always left unlocked. I pulled it open and the napkins were right there, a shrink-wrapped brick of them sitting on top of a row of hanging files. I grabbed the napkins. Then, I saw the tab on the nearest folder. It was labeled with my name in my mother's handwriting, and underneath my name, in smaller letters, the word education. I stood there for a second. The noise from the party came through the walls, muffled and cheerful and completely disconnected from what was happening in that room. I don't know what made me open it. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the 3-year-old version of me that always wanted to know what the adults were saying when they left the room. I set the napkins on the desk and lifted the cover. The first page was a statement from an investment account. My grandfather had opened it. His name was printed at the top in the account holder field, and in the beneficiary section, my name. He had opened the account when I was 8 years old. I recognized the signature at the bottom. That particular looping cursive he used on birthday cards and Christmas checks right up until he passed away when I was 19. The description in the account purpose field said funds designated for post-secondary education expenses. I turned the pages slowly. The early statements showed regular deposits. Small ones first, $30 or $50 at a time, then larger ones as the years moved forward. By the time I was 16, the balance was substantial. Not life-changing money, but real money. Enough that the conversation we had at the kitchen table my senior year of high school, where my parents told me there was nothing saved and I would need loans and a work-study job, should have gone differently. The deposit stopped 2 months before that conversation. After the deposit stopped, withdrawals started. They came in uneven amounts. Some signed by my mother. A few signed by my uncle, my father's younger brother, who had been between jobs more than once over the years and who my parents were always quietly helping. The notes in the memo line said things like family loan and temporary assistance and, in one case, just the word MISC. None of it said anything about tuition. None of it said anything about me. The account was closed before I started my freshman year. The final balance was $14. I stood in that office with the folder open in my lap and listened to the sound of my family celebrating in the backyard and felt something in my chest go very, very still. Not numb. Still. Like the moment before a car alarm goes off and the whole street hasn't registered the sound yet. I took out my phone and I photographed every page. I didn't rush. I went in order, one after another, making sure each image was clear before I moved to the next. When I was done, I straightened the papers exactly as I had found them, closed the folder, slid it back between the other files, shut the drawer, picked up the napkins, and walked back out to the party. Nobody asked where I'd been. Tessa was doing a toast. I stood near the back and held a glass of sparkling water and watched my family clink glasses, and I thought about 11 years of minimum payments on student loans, and the 2 years I ate mostly pasta and worked double shifts at a restaurant to avoid going further into debt, and the 3 times I had called my parents asking for help and been told gently but firmly that they just didn't have it. I drove home 2 hours later. On the interstate, I kept both hands on the wheel and didn't turn on the radio. The quiet lasted about 4 days. I went to work. I came home. I made dinner. Watched whatever was on. Went to bed. Underneath all of it, I kept returning to the images on my phone, flipping through them at night with the screen brightness turned down. Each time I looked, I was hoping I had misread something. Each time, the numbers said what they said. On the 5th day, I called my father's older sister, my Aunt Rosalind, who lived in Scottsdale and had always been the one family member who spoke to me like I was a full person rather than a supporting character. We weren't extremely close, but we were honest with each other in a way that I didn't have with many people in that family. I told her what I had found, all of it, in order. The account, the deposits, the withdrawals, my mother's signature, my uncle's, the dates, the balance at the end. I told her about the kitchen table conversation senior year and the loans I was still paying off. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she wasn't entirely surprised, and that sentence landed harder than almost anything else she could have said. She told me that when my grandfather died, there had been some discussion among the adults about the account. She had assumed it went to me. She had never thought to ask, and now she was telling me she was sorry she hadn't. She asked me what I wanted to do. I told her I wasn't sure yet. She said whatever I decided, she would help if she could. That night, I looked up estate attorneys in my area. I also looked up financial elder abuse statutes in Ohio and what it meant legally when funds designated for a specific beneficiary were redirected without that person's knowledge or consent. The search results were not comforting, but they were clarifying. I wrote down 2 names from a bar association referral list and called the first one the next morning. The attorney's office was on the 2nd floor of a building downtown, above a print shop. She was a small woman in her late 50s, with reading glasses on a chain, and a very organized desk. I brought printed copies of everything, which she appreciated. She didn't interrupt while I explained the situation. When I finished, she asked a series of precise questions about dates, relationships, and documentation. Then she reviewed each page I had brought, making small marks in the margins with a mechanical pencil. She explained that what I was describing, a designated educational account with a named beneficiary that had been drawn down by third parties without the beneficiary's knowledge, was potentially actionable depending on the structure of the account and the laws governing it at the time. She said she would need to request the original account documents from the financial institution directly. She said this would take a few weeks, but that what I had found appeared to be more than a misunderstanding. Hearing that from someone who had no stake in my family's feelings or comfort was strange. I had spent 11 years carrying a low-level suspicion that my family had prioritized other things over my future. Having a professional look at the same information and describe it in legal language made the suspicion feel real and heavy in a way it hadn't before. I told her to move forward. She sent a formal letter to my parents and my uncle notifying them that the account was under legal review and that all parties who had signing authority during the period in question were being asked to preserve any relevant documents. The letter did not accuse anyone directly. It stated facts and made requests. It was short and precise, and I imagine it landed in my mother's mailbox like a small, controlled explosion. I knew it had arrived because my phone rang 12 times in one afternoon. I let every call go to voicemail. My mother left 4 messages. My father left 2. My uncle called once and didn't leave a message. Tessa called 3 times. The last call was from a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be my aunt from Pittsburgh, who had apparently been briefed by my mother and wanted to encourage me to consider what this was doing to the family. I listened to all of the voicemails in sequence sitting at my kitchen table. My mother's were the longest. She moved through several versions of the same argument. The first was confusion. She didn't understand why I was doing this, or who had been putting ideas in my head. The second was context. Those had been hard years. There were things I didn't know about. Sacrifices had been made that I wasn't giving credit for. The third version was grief. She was heartbroken that I would go to a lawyer instead of coming to her directly. The fourth, which was the shortest, was simply that she hoped I would think about Tessa and the wedding and what I was going to do to the family, right before what was supposed to be a happy time. I sat with those messages for a while. I thought about the version of me that would have heard that last one and felt guilty enough to back down. She was not so far away that I couldn't feel her. That instinct to smooth things over, to make myself smaller so everyone else could feel comfortable, but she wasn't making the decisions anymore. I sent one text to the family group thread. It said that I had found documentation of a savings account established by my grandfather for my education, that funds from that account had been withdrawn over a period of years by parties other than the intended beneficiary, and that the matter was being reviewed by an attorney. I said I would not be discussing it further over text or phone, and that any questions about the process could go through my attorney's office. After I sent it, I put my phone face down on the counter and made a cup of tea and stood at my kitchen window watching traffic pass on the street below. Tessa responded 2 hours later. Her message was long and written in the tone she used when she believed she was being reasonable. She said she didn't know anything about a college fund. She said she had always thought I chose to take out loans because that was what worked for me. She said she was 3 years younger than me and had been a child during most of the period in question, and that I was clearly going through something, but she hoped I understood what this was going to cost the family at the worst possible time. I noticed she did not ask whether what I had found was true. My Aunt Rosalind called 2 days after the letters went out. She had spoken to a friend of hers who knew something about financial law, and she had a few specific questions for my attorney. She was not aggressive about it. She was matter-of-fact the way she always was. She said she had also spoken with 2 of my cousins who had apparently heard a version of events from my mother that bore very little resemblance to what I had described. She wanted me to know that she believed what I had found. Having one person in my family say that without qualification was more than I expected. I thanked her and told her I was okay, which was mostly true. The attorney's office received the official account records about 3 weeks after the request. The records confirmed everything in the documents I had photographed. The account was opened in my name as the sole beneficiary. The deposits were consistent and purposeful. The withdrawals in the later years were large, irregular, and signed by my mother and my uncle, with memo notations that had nothing to do with educational expenses. The account was closed 2 months before I started college. The total amount that had been diverted, when calculated with a reasonable estimate of what it would have grown to if left untouched, was significantly more than I had expected. Significantly more than anyone in my family had likely assumed I would be able to quantify. My attorney prepared a formal demand. It outlined the account history, identified the responsible parties, and stated a repayment figure along with a deadline. It also noted that if the matter was not resolved voluntarily, the next step would be filing in civil court. The response from my parents' side came through a family law attorney they had apparently retained quickly. The letter pushed back on the valuation method, argued that the statute of limitations was a relevant consideration, and suggested that any withdrawals had been made in good faith to address urgent family needs. It was not a denial, it was a negotiation. My attorney called me after she had read it. She said this was actually a better outcome than stonewalling, because it meant they were not going to fight the underlying facts, only the amount. She said she was confident we would land somewhere reasonable. She sounded almost cheerful about it in the calm, professional way of someone who had done this 100 times. I was not cheerful. I sat in my car in the parking garage of my office building and pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and thought about the kitchen table where I had been told with a straight face that there was nothing saved. My parents had sat across from me with the knowledge of that account somewhere in their chests and had watched me pick up a pen and start filling out loan paperwork. My mother had said, "I hope this doesn't set you back too far." My father had patted my shoulder. My uncle had not been at that table, but his signature was on the withdrawal forms, and he had apparently received enough of that money to make it worth being named. The settlement was reached before anything went to court. The number was lower than the original demand but substantially higher than nothing. The repayment schedule was structured over 3 years, attached to a formal agreement that my attorney made sure was documented correctly. It would not cover the full cost of my loans or the interest I had already paid, and it would not give back the years of financial stress or the opportunities I hadn't taken because I couldn't afford the risk. But it was real money, and it was going to come to me on paper. And in fact, when my attorney called to confirm the agreement, I asked her if this happened often. She said more often than people thought. She said most of the time, it stayed quiet because the person who had been harmed didn't know what to look for or felt too responsible for the family's comfort to look. I thought about that for a long time after I hung up. The fallout moved through the family in the way these things do, unevenly and loudly in some places with cold silences in others. My mother told several relatives her version, which involved me being manipulated by an outside party and acting impulsively at a vulnerable time. My uncle stopped responding to family group messages entirely. Tessa postponed one of her wedding planning calls with me, and then postponed another, and eventually we just stopped scheduling them. The engagement party felt far away, even though it had only been a couple of months. I thought about myself standing at the back of that party, holding a glass of sparkling water, knowing what I'd found, and not saying a word. I didn't regret leaving it that way. I had needed time to understand what I was holding before I decided what to do with it. My father called me near the end of the settlement process. Not to argue, he said, just to talk. His voice had that same tiredness in it that I had heard all my life, the sound of a man who had spent decades hoping that staying in the middle would keep everything from breaking. He didn't say my mother had been wrong, but he didn't say she hadn't been either. He said he was sorry I had carried the loans the way I had. He said he had thought there were other ways it had evened out. And now he could see that maybe it hadn't. It was not enough. It also wasn't nothing. I told him I appreciated that he said it. I told him I needed some time before I would be ready to sit in a room with either of them. He said he understood. We got off the phone without any resolution, which was maybe the most honest conversation we'd had in years. I didn't go to the wedding. I had been removed from the bridal party already, and attending as a guest felt like agreeing to perform normalcy while my mother and my uncle stood 15 feet away. Tessa and I had one last phone call before the date, a short one that was mostly surface and didn't touch anything real. She said she hoped someday we'd be able to move past this. I said I hoped so too. I meant it, which is complicated. The version of my family I grew up believing in was one where we were all trying our best and falling short in ordinary, forgivable ways. What I found in that filing cabinet was a different version. One where a specific promise, made by someone who loved me, had been quietly unmade by people who needed it more than I did, or at least decided they did. They watched me take out loans. They watched me work double shifts. They listened to me describe how tired I was, and they said, "You're doing great. We're so proud of you." And they knew the whole time. I started therapy the spring after the settlement, not because the legal process required it, but because I had been operating for years on the assumption that my self-doubt was a personal failing rather than a response to an environment that was specifically designed to make me doubt myself. Working through that has been slower and stranger than I expected. There are sessions where I leave feeling like something has loosened, and sessions where I leave feeling like I've just shifted the weight from one shoulder to the other. What I've come to understand is that the money was real and the harm it caused was real, but the thing I'm actually recovering from is older than the account statements. It's the years of being told I was too sensitive, too difficult, too needy, while the people saying it quietly made decisions that benefited themselves at my expense, and then used my silence as proof that everything was fine. I check my loan balance every month now, and every month I watch the settlement payments arrive and go directly toward principal. It will be paid off about 3 years earlier than I had originally projected. That math is concrete and satisfying in a way that a lot of this hasn't been. My grandfather saved that money for me because he believed I would go somewhere and need a foundation under me. He was right about the first part. The foundation just got there late, and it came back to me through a process he never would have imagined and probably would have hated, but it came back. I think about him sometimes when I'm paying that balance down. The careful deposits, year after year. The way he signed his name at the bottom of a document in looping cursive, the same way he signed birthday cards, like he was making a promise in the same handwriting he used to say he loved you. He was, and even if it took 11 years longer than it should have, and even if I had to find a folder in a filing cabinet in an office I wasn't supposed to be in, the promise eventually kept itself. I don't think not forgiving someone has to be permanent, but I also don't think forgiveness means agreeing to forget what was real. What was real is in the account records. It's in the settlement agreement sitting in a folder in my own filing cabinet, one I set up myself with my own labels in my own handwriting. What I choose to do with the rest of it, the family dinners and the phone calls, and how much space I let back in. That's a different question. One I'm answering slowly, on my own terms, in my own time. That's the part they didn't plan for, that I would eventually have my own terms at all. There's a version of this story where I never open that filing cabinet drawer, where I grab the napkins, close the drawer, walk back out to the party, and spend the rest of the evening refilling my glass and pretending the weight in my chest is just tiredness. I lived inside that version for a long time without knowing it. That's the part that stays with me now. Not the betrayal itself, but how many years I spent explaining it away before I had the paperwork to prove I wasn't imagining it. What my grandfather did when he opened that account was a quiet act of faith. He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't tell me. He just put money aside, year after year, in careful increments, because he believed the person I was going to become would need a foundation. That's what integrity looks like when nobody's watching. It doesn't announce itself. It just keeps showing up in the records. What happened to that money afterward was also a choice made quietly. And that's the thing about how we treat other people when we think they won't find out. The action doesn't disappear just because the other person doesn't know yet. It sits in a folder. It waits. The consequences were never a matter of if. They were always a matter of when I found the drawer unlocked. I used to think that fighting back required certainty, that I needed to be completely sure, completely righteous, completely unafraid before I was allowed to take up space and demand something back. What I learned from working with my attorney, from talking to Rosalind, from sitting in that small office above the print shop and watching someone read my documents without flinching, is that you don't need to feel certain. You just need to be willing to find out what's true and let the facts do the work. That's not coldness. That's clarity. And it's something I had to build in myself the hard way. One document at a time. The years of loans, the double shifts, the opportunities I quietly declined because I couldn't absorb the financial risk. None of that gets erased. The settlement doesn't give me back my 20s or the version of my career I might have built with a different starting point. But there is something meaningful about watching the balance go down every month and knowing that the math has finally corrected itself, even partially. That's what persistence looks like when it has nowhere dramatic to land. It's just showing up to pay a bill, and one month the number is smaller, and then smaller again, and eventually it's gone. Tessa sent me a message 6 months after the wedding asking if I wanted to get coffee sometime. I haven't answered yet. Not out of anger. I'm past the part where anger is the main thing I feel about any of this. I just don't know yet what I want that relationship to be, and I've learned that not knowing is a legitimate place to stay for a while. I don't owe anyone a timeline on my own healing. What I believe now, in a way I didn't at 22 or 25, is that the people who quietly do right by others, the ones who make deposits nobody sees, who show up to move furniture, who tell the truth in family group threads, even when it costs them something, those people are building something real. And the people who help themselves to what was never theirs are also building something. They just don't always see the invoice until it arrives. Mine arrived on a Tuesday in an ordinary envelope with a case number printed at the top. And for the first time in a long time, I was the one holding the paperwork,